Okay, so we've discussed in part one of the module what makes a system a family, because we have a lot of systems in the world, but what makes a system a family? What are the characteristics of a family? Now what we're going to talk about is how that family system fits within a larger societal context. Because what we know is that families don't exist in isolation, just like individuals don't exist in isolation. Families are very complex and dynamic and ever-changing, and they are impacted by the larger societal systems, and they impact the individual's development. This is a shift in thinking for us, as most of your training as counselors will focus on the intrapsychic perspective. You'll think about the individual's development and what does that mean for the individual, and how do you as a counselor impact that. For some of you, you'll find as you're doing your work that you keep thinking of the larger system. You think, well, this individual is having this situation or facing this issue, but if I could just get this family member in here, or this partner in here, or some other person from the system in here, then I could really make a change in the family's life. Or when you talk about an individual's issue, you'll immediately find yourself kind of situating it within a larger context, and you're taking a systemic perspective. For those of you who that systemic perspective resonates fully with, that feels like the right fit for you, this family class is going to share some information that'll be helpful for you as you go throughout your work with individuals. So what's the difference between a systemic perspective and an intrapsychic perspective? Well, systemic perspective takes the position that the individual's development happens within the context of emotional relationships and connections with others. So to help the individual, you consider how that individual is situated within the various systems in which he or she is a part of, starting largely with the family system. In counseling, this allows us to say, or encourages us to think of the family as the fulcrum point between individual and society. So you've got individual development and societal influences. And within that family is kind of a bridge between those two. That's is the critical juncture between those two, a part that has an influence. The family is influenced by society, and the family influences the individual's development. So for the counselor who has a systemic perspective, you often find yourself thinking of the family level as being the perfect opening for therapeutic intervention. From a systemic perspective, the family life cycle forms the context within which all individual development occurs, or most individual development occurs. Families have a shared history and a shared future. Individuals never fully leave a family. Like, you may leave your family, you may find modern families now are separated by great geographical distance, emotional distance. We're separated by careers and the responsibilities of within our smaller family units. We're separated from extended families by responsibilities within our smaller family units. But even when we're separated, we're impacted by those families. Individuals don't really exit. They can break from a family, can disconnect from a family, but their influence is still felt. So our understanding of the family in part is informed by learning who is considered part of the family and who has been part of the family, and how are entrances and exits of family members managed. Other key distinctions between the two, the intrapsychic model or systemic model, is that physical laws in and of themselves don't adequately account for complex human interactions. They're part of it, but they're not the full part of it for the systemic perspective. The intrapsychic models look at linear cause and effect relationships, but systemic models really look at process, that's circular reciprocal cause and effect. There's in an intrapsychic model there's an encouragement of a shift toward focus on objectivity in the therapeutic process, but in the systemic model, we recognize there are a lot of influences, a lot of contextual influences, and the understanding is subjective. For intrapsychic, the focus is on the individual, and for systemic, the focus is on the system, and this efforts to change the individual work through the system. And then you have quantitative or qualitative. Honestly, those can really apply to both. Intrapsychic, when you look at it this way, looks more like of a quantitative model because of the objectivity, the linear cause and effect, but honestly, qualitative and quantitative could go both ways. The systemic paradigm asserts that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If you want to understand what's happening at any one point, you look at the whole, you look at the system. The components of the system you try to understand the components of the system within the context of the system and within the context of the system's connections to larger systems. So that all of these pieces, that like, how does the family fit within a larger societal context? We have to understand that, and you conceptualize that. And as a counselor, that piece about does it resonate with you, that matters, because you'll find yourself as a person who already kind of conceptualizing that. You look at the roles of societal influences or contextual influences on your individual client in a way that orients you to a systems focus. So what are these pieces? You've got your individual, the development of the individual, the development of the immediate family, the process for the immediate family, the extended, then the larger community, and then larger society. But all of these systems all of these are moving through time. So you don't have, it's not static. There's a lot of change that happens at all levels, and a lot of impacts across the levels. For this approach, and this is what in one of your readings, all of the pieces that are highlighted in this little presentation are pulled out from your readings for this week, so you'll have more information in your readings, but there's some pieces I wanted to highlight. So we talk about stress, and we're talking about forces moving through these systems and impacting these systems. So on the systemic level, you have a lot of influences. You have sociocultural, political, economic. You have neighborhood influences, friendships. You have influences within the extended family and individual. And then you have these forces that are at play at all of these levels as well. At the individual level, you have the forces of the genetic makeup, your abilities and disabilities. At the immediate family level, some forces that these will be viewed as forces that would cause a negative form of stress, but violence, addiction, ignorance, depression, lack of spiritual expression or dreams, all of those would be on the negative side. But you have other forces that would be the complements of those. When you consider the spiritual expression forces, how do we identify with our religious groups? What are the family perspectives and strengths? Those are forces at play too. Then your extended family, what are the emotional patterns? What are the rules, the myths, the triangles, the relationships, secrets, legacies, losses, trauma? What are the forces that are at play in that extended family? And then as you go up, you see the forces at each level, right? You can read those. And they all impact each level. So racism in larger society manifests as relationship issues and connections in the community. And then within the extended family, what are the stories relative to race and racism that are told in your family, and how do they impact your extended family's relationships with the larger society and your community and with each other? Then within the immediate family, how do those stories play out? How do expectations of roles and responsibilities and hopes and dreams for your family, how are they impacted by the racism that is present in larger society, that's manifestation of that in the community, perceptions of extended? How does that manifest in your immediate family? And then on the individual, how does it impact your individual development? So you can look at any one of these pieces. You can look at perceptions of gender and role. A vertical stressor in larger society, it would be sexism, right? But then how does that play out at each level, and how does that impact ultimately the individual's development? The horizontal stressors of moving through time, horizontal, you see how that arrow's moving through time. You have life cycle transitions, migrations, the unpredictable ones like transitions of death, illness, accidents, unemployment, and then historical events through time that are impacting your larger society and then thus impact each level. So you've got flows of stress through time, and then major forces shifting down, the vertical stressors. And with each of these, you can look, as a counselor, you might look at any one level to better understand another level, or as a way to understand, to make a conceptualization of how what's happening with this individual and a blocker for this individual's development has repercussions or impacts. There have been impacts that have brought you to this point through these other levels. But the systemic influence, an individual perspective, this is an individual comes to you and has a perception of has an issue that individual brings, and you start to think, like, how does it fit within, how is it oriented within larger society, extended family forces and stories? It's just a different way of looking at it. And the stages of the family life cycle. So as a family develops, it's developing within this much larger systemic and societal context. But it has stages of development just like an individual goes through stages of development. A family does not just poof into being. There are a lot of stages of development. So an individual reaches a point where that individual leaves home as a single young adult, meets someone, makes a connection, begins to form a family, a partnership, a couple in partnership. They may introduce children into that family, and if they do, then those children, as they move through individual life cycle development stages, you'll see those present with the family's life cycle development. Or if they don't introduce children, then what do you see? How does that role shift, and what are the family's roles later in life? And how at each level what are the key processes of transition that are important to that level of development and life cycle, and how are they successfully resolved? With these developmental issues, you'll see too that there are changes that the individuals must make in order to orient themselves to be successful as a family member and to contribute to the success of that family and the family's wellness in that stage. There are additional stages of the life cycle for families that experience divorce, as you'll see here, and there are additional stages for the life cycle of families that experience remarriage and reorganization. Right? Those pieces are covered in some of in the next slide too. That piece is covered in the next slide. But why is the family life cycle important? The family life cycle is important because the individual life cycle is happening within the context of that family life cycle. So from a systemic perspective, you want to understand the family life cycle. What are the key developmental stages that we need, developmental transitions and issues that we might see, the markers that are going to tell us how this family is moving through this stage? What do we know about this stage? What do we know about what the family's story and the family's history and the narrative of the family within this larger context like we've discussed before? If we're talking about divorce, what are the stories about divorce or narratives about divorce that this larger extended family holds to be truth? And how are those stories impacting how the individual experiencing this divorce in their smaller family, their family unit, their immediate family unit, how does that inform how they see themselves experiencing this divorce? All those contextual issues have to be considered. And when you think about the remarriage piece, with what we know about families is that an individual after divorce, the partner that is divorced and then the partner that remarries, so for the partner who remarries, the ex-partner from before still has an influence. The lessons that you learn together, the things that you learn, the way you develop it, we impact each other, and our impacts are felt. It's like that butterfly ripple, around the world. Well, the impacts reverberate over the course of your lifetime. We also know that there are plenty of families that are not in partnered relationships, that they are headed by a single parent. Some of the facts about single parents that you may be interested are shared here. And when we think about, if you look at that at the bottom, where it says 79.5% of custodial single mothers are employed, 90% of custodial single fathers are employed. What that tells us is those families aren't living in isolation either. The employers, the systems in which that parent operates, they're informing that family's context and decisions that are getting made in that family and family processes. Later in our class, we're going to be talking about genograms. Genograms help us to map our family context and characteristics. This is just a brief example, right? Just a brief example of a genogram. But if you glance at this, you can see that these things, this person was considered a hero of Jews in Hamburg. Well, there's down through this family, that's going to inform that family narrative, right down to the individual client sitting in that family, in that seat, that counseling seat in front of you in that counseling session. They will have been informed by how that narrative has been brought down through their generations to them at this point, and their beliefs about that. In a family, it's complex, it's messy, it can be really confusing, but we definitely all impact each other. We carry it with us through the ages, and by looking at using a systemic perspective and looking at how these larger systems impact our individual clients, we can learn a lot of interesting information that can help to inform our counseling process. And as a family counselor, it's absolutely critical to understand how that systemic perspective requires that you think of that family system as situated within a larger context. And that family life cycle as a life cycle in which the individual life cycles of all the members are happening at the same time. It's complex, it's dynamic, it's ever-changing, and it's exciting. So I hope that you will enjoy your work with families this semester, and this concludes this brief presentation.